7, 8, 9, 10.
Hey, that's it, buddy. You gotta go find another shop.
You can't play no more. Cancel the hand.
Welcome back to another episode of my life as an advantaged blackjack player. Today we are back in Las Vegas where I'm trying to get away with some high stakes advantage play. The casinos are not super thrilled to have their games beaten, so they are on the lookout for people like me. I had already played at quite a few casinos on this trip, so my name was hot, and not in a good way. Casinos that I've already played at communicate using a flyer, which has my info and tells other places to be on the lookout for me. This means that any surveillance worker worth his salt will want me out of there as soon as they figure out who I am. Sessions will be short, and all I can hope for is that the cards come out in my favor when I have the big bets out. For any newcomers to the channel, I'm playing Blackjack and I'm using the high-low counting method to determine when I have an advantage. As my advantage increases, so do my bets. My bet spread is on screen, and as you can see, I play from table minimum up to either one hand of $2,000 if I'm solo, or two hands of $1,200 if I'm playing with other people at the table. I also play using perfect basic strategy as well as some count-based deviations. These charts dictate everything I do. There's never any guessing what my next move is. If you guys want to learn exactly what I'm doing, check out my how to count cards video. Link is in the description and it has everything you need to know to get up to speed on advantage blackjack. In my last video, I played at Green Valley Ranch, M Resort, and South Point. Things didn't go well and I lost $2,065. Losing sessions happen all the time for an advantage player, almost as often as the winning sessions. The edge over the house is small and losing is to be expected. Regardless, I was hoping to turn that around today and make some profit instead of a donation. The first spot I headed to was a casino called Planet Hollywood. They have several decent games, but I had my sights set on the high limit double deck. I made my way in there, bought in, and started playing. The table minimum was $100, which is quite expensive, but the positive counts should be plentiful.
Hi. How you doing? Not bad. You can't play no more. Okay. You gotta deal the hand now. Let's finish the hand.
We can cancel it.
Alright. Cancel the hand. You can play anything but blackjack. Okay.
Have a good one.
Take care.
Unfortunately, I only got a few hands in at minimum bet before being told I can't play here. At least they're efficient. For the few hands that I did play, I managed to scrounge together $150 of profit, and with that I was on to a new spot, specifically Palace Station. Here I was looking again for some double deck action. It was early on in the day, so I was hoping it wasn't too busy. If I was lucky, I'd be able to catch a table heads up. Unfortunately, once I got in there, I saw that they only had a couple tables open and were quite busy. This means my rounds per hour was going to be low, which directly translates to a lower EV per hour. EV is a theoretical hourly rate calculated off game conditions, speed, and bet sizes. I was going to have to make do with this busy table, so I sat down and got to work. As always, I will skip through the negative counts and minimum bets, so let's fast forward to our first positive true count of 1. I raised my bet from table minimum to $100 and was dealt an 11 versus dealer 6. 11 always doubles, so I threw out another $100 and was dealt a 4 for 15. This means the dealer had some work to do. Sadly, she ended up drawing to 17, so this first hand was no good. The count was now up to a true 4, which means I was raising my bets quite aggressively. I had to buy in so that I could fund two hands of $500. I put them out there and crossed my fingers. I was dealt a 20 and a 13 versus dealer 6, so I stood on both. The camera angle here isn't great, but the dealer ended up drawing to 17 again, which means I lost one hand and won the other. I was hoping my luck would turn because the true count was now 6, which means I was buying in again to raise my bet to two hands of 1,000. I say luck because even though I'm playing with an advantage, these are very short-term results we're looking at and the cards can really go either way. Out went the two hands of 1,000 and I was dealt an 18 on both. Dealer was showing a 9, I stood both, and of course the dealer had a 10 underneath for 19, which means both my hands lost. Great. The count had now dropped to a true 3, bordering on a true 4, and I lowered my bet to two hands of $400. I was dealt a 20 and a 17 versus dealer's 8, and again I stood on both. It would be nice if the dealer could just bust for once. Of course she had a 10 underneath, so I lost one and won the other for a push. After this, the count went negative for a hand, so I was back to minimum bets. It quickly recovered to a true 1, so out went the $100 bet. I was dealt a 14 versus 10. I tried to hit, but I didn't even get the chance because dealer had Blackjack. The count was now back in the negatives, and I knew it would be the last hand, so I just sat this one out. I was gonna have to be patient for a chance to make any of this back. Unfortunately, I wouldn't be making any money back here because my time was up at Palace Station. Not a great session to start the day with. All in all, I got 11 minutes in, my hourly EV was $650, and my total session loss was $2,325. Nothing to do but move on to the next spot and hope for some better luck. This means I was on my way to Gold Coast. Once again, I was targeting their double deck. The game they have here is not super great, and it took a while for me to get into the positive counts. I played a few shoes that were mostly negative, but the count did hit true 1 a couple times. Here's the first one I saw. I raised my bet to $100 and was dealt a soft 14 versus dealer 7. I hit it into a soft 18 and stood. Dealer drew to 21, so this one was no good. After a while, the count hit true 1 again, and I was dealt a 13 versus 10. I didn't even get a chance to turn this one into a 23 because the dealer had Blackjack. Once again, I was back into the negatives for a bit before the count recovered. I was dealt a soft 18 versus dealer 6, which means it was time for a double. Luckily, the dealer ended up busting, so we got a nice little win here. After this, I played an entire shoe in the negative before the count made it back to a true 1. I was dealt a soft 18 versus 7, which I stood on. Dealer ended up busting, so this one was also a win. I left my bet out and was dealt a 12 versus dealers 2. I hit, turning it into a 22, so this one broke the winning streak. The count went negative after this hand, and the dealer was insanely slow, so I jumped over to a different table. I played some negatives for a bit until the count got up to a true 1 again. I raised my bet to $100 and was dealt a 13 versus dealers 3. I stood and the dealer drew to 18, so this one was a loss. I tried again and was dealt a 9 versus dealers 10. I turned it into a 20 and stood. Dealer also had 20, so this one was a push. The count dropped back to 0 for one hand before returning to a true 1, so out went the $100 bet again. I was dealt a 12 versus dealers 10, which I turned into a 17. It was no use though, as the dealer had a 10 underneath. The only upside here was that the count finally had risen above a true 1. My true count conversion left me somewhere between a true 2 and 3, so I settled on a bet of $250. I was dealt a 20 versus dealer 6. I stood and the dealer drew to a bust. Finally. Count was back down to a true 1, so I dropped my bet. I was dealt a 13 versus 4, which I stood on. Dealer ended up busting again, so this one also won. All those small cards brought the count up to a true 3, and I raised my bet to $400. I was dealt a 20 versus dealers 2, and you'd think that would be a winning hand. 2s are the worst, so much can go wrong, and the dealer drew to 20 as well. What a waste. Count was now down to a true 2, so I lowered my bet to $200. I was dealt a 17 versus dealers 8. Of course the dealer had a 10 underneath, so this one was a loss. That was the last hand of the shoe, so I was back to minimum bets. It didn't take long for us to get into some positive counts again, and we hit a true 2 shortly into the next shoe. I was dealt a 10 versus dealers 5. 10 always doubles versus dealers 2 through 9, so I did just that. Dealer ended up busting, so I won this $400 hand. The count was now up to a true 4, so I raised my bet to $600. I was dealt an 18 versus dealers 10. I had to stay, and sadly the dealer had a 9 underneath, so this one was no good. I was definitely starting to catch some heat at this point, judging by the pit boss standing directly in front of me, giving me the stare down. I had bigger things to worry about because we were still in a very positive shoe. True count was 3, so I dropped my bet to $400. I was dealt a 17 versus dealers 10, and once again, dealer must be allergic to busting or something because she had a 10 underneath, meaning another loss for me. True count was now down to 2, so I lowered my bet to $200. Finally, we get a blackjack. Of course it's on the smaller bet. Still a win though, so can't be mad. The count dropped further to a true 1, so I was back to my $100 bet. I was dealt a 12 versus 4, which I stood on. Dealer ended up drawing to 21, so this one was no good. Once again, the count began to rise, and I upped my bet to $200. I was dealt a 9 versus dealer's 5, which is a great double opportunity. Dealer ended up busting, so this hand was paid out. We were now up to a true 4, so once again my bet rose, this time to $600. I was dealt a 12 versus dealer's 5, which I gladly stood on. You guys know my track record with 12s in the high counts. I crossed my fingers for the dealer bust. She came through for us this time, drawing to 25, so finally we won a big bet. Count was now up to a true 5, and I raised my bet to $1,200. I was dealt an 18 versus dealer's 5, which of course I stood on. Amazingly, the dealer busted again, meaning this massive bet was paid out. The heat was definitely on at this point, and I knew I didn't have much time left here, especially since that was the last hand of the shoe and the pit boss was about to watch me drop from a $1,200 bet all the way down to table minimum. The next 3 shoes were entirely negative, which means I didn't raise my bet at all. Finally, after seemingly forever, the count hit a true 2 again. I wasn't playing solo anymore, so I raised my bet to 2 hands of $200. The pit manager had been waiting for this moment, and I'm surprised I even got this last hand in. I was dealt a soft 15 versus dealer's 3. I turned it into a hard 15 and stood. On my second hand, I was dealt an 18, which of course I also stood on. Dealer pulled some bullshit and ended up drawing to 20, so both these hands lost. I tried to get another 2 hands of 200 out, but my time here was up.
Hey, that's it, buddy. You gotta go find another stop.
You guys heard the man. They don't want my action, so I was off to find another stop. This session was a bit more successful than the last. All in all, I got 1 hour of play. My hourly EV was $462, and I left with a profit of $1,390. This was a nice little win, but I was still down for the day. It was going to take some more work to get it back, so I was headed to the Strat. This is one of my favorite Vegas casinos. The architecture is cool, and they have a couple of solid games, so what's not to like? This is probably the best Vegas session I've caught on film so far. There's some massive swings that all took place within a couple shoes, and I'm excited to show it to you guys. I got in there, found the highest EV table possible, which was once again a double deck game. Time to get to work. This first hand is a great example of the high-low system in action. In high-low, you keep a running count of point values that are assigned to low, neutral, and high cards. Low cards are +1, neutral cards are 0, and high cards are -1. In this first hand, we had 3 low cards and 1 high card come out. This leaves us with a running count of 2. To determine the true count, we need to divide the running count by the number of decks remaining to be played. Since this was the first hand, we were dividing by 2 decks remaining. 2 divided by 2 is 1, so the true count was 1. This means I was raising my bet to $100 for the second hand. As I keep playing, I'll continue updating the running count, and as the game goes on, the deck divisor becomes smaller and smaller. This means the highest counts usually occur later on in the game. So let's see how this shoe plays out. With my $100 bet out, I was dealt a 13 versus dealer 6, which I stood on. Dealer drew to 21, so this was bad news for me. If you guys have been counting along, you know that the running count is now 4. 4 divided by 2 is 2, so true count is now 2. This means I was upping my bet to $200. I was dealt a 5 versus dealer's 10, which I hit into a 17. I was prepared to lose this one, but surprisingly, the dealer ended up busting. True count had now jumped to 3. I was using a deck divisor of 1.6 repeating here, so I raised my bet to $400. I was dealt a 13 versus dealer's 10. I had to hit, and sadly, this one ended up busting. The count was now borderline between true 3 and 4, so I settled on a bet of $500. I was dealt a 14 versus dealer's 10. Once again, I had to hit, and of course, I busted. We were now back to a true 3, so I lowered my bet to $400. I was dealt a 5 versus dealer's 10, which I turned into a 19. I felt a bit better but was still expecting to lose. Luckily the dealer drew to a bust, so this one was a win. True count was back to 4, so out went the $600 bet. I was dealt an 11 versus dealer's 2, which means I was pulling out cash to double. I had a feeling I was going to need a 10 if I was going to beat this too, and I was pretty close to being right. Dealer drew to 19, so I needed a 9 or 10. Things worked out for me this time, and this $1,200 bet was paid. The count was now somewhere between a true 4 and 5, and I raised my bet to $800. I was dealt a 13 versus dealer's 10. I swear I get way too many 13s in the high counts. I had to hit, and luckily I didn't bust. I stuck with my 18 and prayed the dealer didn't have a 10 underneath. Amazingly, this hand worked out. We were now up to a true 6, which means I was raising my bet to $1,500. I was dealt a 17 versus 10. Why does the dealer always have to have a 10? I had to stay, and sadly the dealer had a 10 underneath, so this one was a loss. Count was back down to a true 3, so I lowered my bet to $400. I was dealt a 10 versus dealer's 10. True count had now risen to 4 with these new cards, so that means I was doubling. The dealer ended up drawing to 22, so this double was paid out. I upped my bet to $500, which means count was between a true 3 and 4. I was dealt a 20 versus dealer's 4. I stood, and the dealer ended up drawing to 25, so this one was a win. I was gonna get another chance at the $1,500 bet because the count was back to a true 6. I threw it out there and was dealt a soft 15 versus dealer's 8. Once again, the cards went the wrong way here because I ended up busting. Goodbye, $1,500. That was the last hand of the shoe, so I was back to minimum bets for a bit. I played an entire shoe in the negative and was really hoping I didn't get backed off before I had a chance to raise my bets again. I did not want to finish the session like this. Surprisingly, I didn't, and shortly into the next shoe the count hit a true 2. I put out my $200 bet and was dealt a 12 versus dealer's 10. This next hit is going to defy all logic, but somehow I ended up with a 9 for 21. Dealer had a 20, but this time I was laughing. I left my bet out and was dealt an 8 versus dealer's 7. I turned it into an 18 and stood. Dealer was not having it as he drew to 20, so this one was no good. I tried again and was dealt an 11 versus dealer's 4. Of course I doubled, and the dealer ended up drawing masterfully to 17. I was going to need a 7 or better to win this one, which sadly I did not have. All those small cards brought the count up to a true 5, so I raised my bet to $1,200. Please, no more 13s and 14s. I was dealt a soft 15 versus dealer's 9. Of course this one didn't work out and I busted. It can be almost hilarious how shitty the cards can get in the high counts. On the bright side, the count was now up to a true 6, so I had another crack at it. I bought in and threw out my $1,500 bet. I was dealt an 11 versus dealer's 10. You guys know what time it is. I bought in another $1,500 and put out my double.
Let's hope.
600, 18, 7, 8, 9, 10. There you go, 20.
Thank you.
Finally, a bet in a high true count actually worked out. I was paid out $3,000 and raised my bet to $2,000, seeing as we were at a true 7 or higher. I was dealt a 13 versus dealer's 10. They were really making me work for it here. I turned my 13 into a 19 and crossed every finger I had. Yes, you did see that right. Dealer did not have a 10 underneath, he had a 7, which means my $2,000 bet was paid out. Nice. Count was still a true 7 or higher, so I left my $2,000 bet out. Finally, I was dealt a half decent hand of 20, unfortunately it was against an ace. I bought insurance, dealer did not have blackjack, so all he had to do now was draw to something less than 20 or bust. So that's where all the aces were. Dealer drew to 18, which means my 20 was good enough for a win. All those high cards brought the true count down to 4. It must have been just above a true 4 because I settled on a bet of $700. I was dealt a soft 14 versus dealer's 3, and for once I actually turned a soft total into a decent hand of 20. Dealer drew to 18, so this one was paid out. True count was back up to 7, so I raised my bet once again to $2,000. I was dealt another f***ing 13, like come on. There must have been a glitch in the matrix or something because I somehow got dealt an 8 for 21. Dealer's 20 didn't have shit on me and this $2,000 bet was paid. The count had dropped to a true 6, so I lowered my bet to $1,500. I was dealt a 20 versus dealer 6, and any sane person would be happy with this. However, all I see is EV, so that means it was time to split the 10s. My first split is dealt another 10, so I split again. I get a 16 on my first hand and stay. I get another 10 on my second hand, so I split for the 4th time. My second hand is a 20, which I stay on. My third hand is a 17, another stay. And finally, the 4th hand is a 12. Nothing to do but stay. So I had a 16, a 20, a 17, and a 12 versus dealer 6. $6,000 on the line, and all the dealer has to do is bust. Just kidding. Well, that is ugly. Why couldn't he just bust? The 10 split rarely works out for me, but it's such high EV that I just have to do it. All in all, we only lost $1,500 on that hand, so it could have been a lot worse. Could have been a lot better too. That was the last hand of the shoe, so we shuffled up and got into a new one. I definitely didn't have any friends in the pit at this point, so I knew my back off was imminent. The count did hit a true 1 on this next shoe, so I upped my bet to $100. I was dealt a blackjack versus dealer's ace, no even money, and the dealer didn't end up having it. After this, the count went negative, so I was back to minimum bets. However, I didn't last long.
Yeah.
Well, but you're not allowed to play blackjack.
What color is that?
As per usual, I got the boot. I could have easily been backed off in the red, so it was pretty cool that I got to keep playing till now. What an awesome way to end the session. All in all, I got 20 minutes in, my hourly EV was $782, and I was leaving with a profit of $5,300. Sweet. This is actually a record session profit for the YouTube, so let's just take a minute to appreciate that. This definitely makes up for what we witnessed earlier at Palace Station. I was finishing the day with a profit of $4,515 over 1 hour and 33 minutes of play. I'm going to end it there for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Next video will have some more great action. I'm talking trespasses and some more very profitable sessions. Make sure you tune in for that. Thank you everyone for watching, and don't be afraid to leave some feedback. I try to read every comment. I'll see you all in the next video. Peace.